There is a story told about the Caliph Harun al-Rashid and a Greek manuscript. The story goes, and stories like this have a way of improving with retelling, so I hold it lightly, that a delegation came to Harun al-Rashid's court in Baghdad, bearing a gift of Greek manuscripts, texts from the philosophical and scientific tradition of the ancient Mediterranean world. The Caliph held one of the manuscripts and asked what it contained. He was told it was a work of philosophy. He held it to his nose and smelled the leather of the binding and the vellum of the pages, and then he placed it in the treasury and ordered that scholars be found who could read it and render it into Arabic. Whether the story is precisely true or not, it captures something real about the specific culture of the Abbasid court in the late 8th and 9th centuries, the culture that produced what we call the Islamic Golden Age, the period from roughly 750 to 1258 CE, when the Islamic world was the most intellectually dynamic civilization on earth, when the city of Baghdad was the largest city in the world, when the scholars who gathered under the patronage of the Abbasid caliphs were doing mathematics and astronomy and medicine and philosophy at a level that the rest of the world would not reach for centuries. I want to take you to Baghdad, not the Baghdad of the present, with its complicated and painful history, but the Baghdad of the late 8th and 9th centuries, the Baghdad that Al-Mansur, the second Abbasid Caliph, founded in 762 CE on the banks of the Tigris River in what is now central Iraq, the Baghdad that grew within a generation into the largest city in the world, the Baghdad that housed the institution called the House of Wisdom, the Round City. Al-Mansur's foundation was called Madinat al-Salam, the City of Peace, and it was designed in a form that was both aesthetically remarkable and cosmologically deliberate. A perfect circle, with a diameter of about 2 kilometers, surrounded by a double wall and a moat, with 4 gates opening in the 4 cardinal directions, and the Caliph's palace and the main mosque at the center. The circle was not merely a practical shape, though it was practical, allowing maximum area within minimum perimeter and providing equal access from all directions. It was a cosmological statement, the city at the center of the world, the Caliph at the center of the city, the axis of power and learning and divine favor running from heaven to earth through the specific point where Al-Mansur had chosen to build. The round city did not survive as an architectural form. Successive floods and the expansion of the city beyond its original walls and the ultimately total destruction wrought by the Mongol army in 1258 CE have left almost nothing of Al-Mansur's planned city visible above ground. What survives is the cultural form, the specific culture of patronage and learning and translation that the Abbasid caliphs created within and around the round city, and that constituted the real achievement of the Baghdad they built. The Abbasid dynasty had come to power in 750 CE, overthrowing the Umayyad Caliphate that had ruled the Islamic world since the death of the Prophet Muhammad's son-in-law Ali in 661 CE. The Abbasids were different from the Umayyads in several specific ways that matter for the story I am telling. The Umayyads had been primarily an Arab dynasty, ruling an Islamic empire, but understanding their authority as rooted in Arab tribal identity and Arab cultural precedents. The Abbasids came to power on the strength of a coalition that included significant Persian support, and their empire was from the beginning more culturally diverse, more willing to incorporate non-Arab Muslim traditions and non-Muslim scholarly traditions into the project of building an Islamic civilization. The specific intellectual consequence of this openness was the translation movement. Beginning in the reign of Al-Mansur and reaching its greatest intensity under Harun al-Rashid and his son al-Mamuni, the Abbasid caliphs sponsored a systematic project of translating the intellectual heritage of the ancient world, Greek philosophy and science, Persian administrative and literary tradition, Indian mathematics and astronomy, into Arabic, the language of the Islamic scholarly tradition. The scale of this translation project was extraordinary. Over the course of roughly 2 centuries, virtually the entire surviving intellectual heritage of the ancient Mediterranean world was rendered into Arabic. Aristotle and Plato, Galen and Hippocrates, Euclid and Archimedes, Ptolemy and Diophantus, and dozens of other works in philosophy and mathematics and astronomy and medicine and engineering, the translators. The specific people who did this work are not as famous as they deserve to be, partly because the nature of translation tends to obscure the translator's contribution behind the translated author's name, and partly because the history of science and philosophy has not always been generous in acknowledging the specific human labor that made the transmission of knowledge possible. But the translators of the Abbasid period were not merely mechanical converters of one language into another. They were scholars of the highest caliber, making specific intellectual choices about how to render difficult concepts in a language that did not have existing vocabulary for them, creating in the process the Arabic scientific and philosophical vocabulary that would transmit these concepts to the medieval West centuries later. Huneyn ibn Ishaq is perhaps the most important of them. A Nestorian Christian born in the Iraqi city of Al-Hira in 809 CE, he became the most prolific and the most technically accomplished translator of the Abbasid period, producing Arabic versions of most of Galen's medical writings and Greek versions of works that existed only in Syriac or Arabic. His method was modern in its rigor. Rather than working from a single manuscript, he collated multiple manuscripts of the same text, correcting errors by comparison, identifying interpolations, establishing the most reliable text before beginning the work of translation. This is the philological method that European humanist scholars would reinvent in the 15th century and praise as a new achievement of the Renaissance. But Huneyn had practiced it 6 centuries earlier in Baghdad. What drove Huneyn was not merely the Caliph's money, though the Caliph's money was generous. The tradition reports that al-Ma'mun paid translators by the weight of the manuscripts they produced in gold, a rate that made translation one of the more lucrative professions in the Baghdad of the early 9th century. What drove him was, from his own accounts, a genuine intellectual passion for the knowledge the texts contained, and for the specific problem of making that knowledge available in a form that Arabic readers could use. He wrote accounts of his translation process that survive, the Risala, a letter describing his translations of Galen, that are among the most interesting documents of the history of scholarship, a self-portrait of a man engaged in the specific, difficult, and entirely worthwhile work of building a bridge between two intellectual traditions, the House of Wisdom. Bayt al-Hikmah in Arabic, the House of Wisdom, the institution that has become the symbol of the Abbasid intellectual achievement, and that was both more and less than the popular imagination has made it. It was not, as sometimes portrayed, a single great library comparable to the Library of Alexandria, a single building in which all the world's knowledge was assembled and from which it was distributed to eager scholars. It was, in its earliest form, primarily a translation bureau and a library attached to the Caliphal Palace, an institutional home for the translation project and for the scholars who worked on it. Over time it expanded in scope and prestige, becoming a center for the original research and writing that the translated knowledge was generating. Al-Ma'mun, who ruled from 813 to 833 CE, was the great patron of the House of Wisdom in its golden period. His reign represents the peak of the specifically intellectual investment of the Abbasid Caliphate, the moment when the translation project was at its most intensive, and when the scholars working under Caliphal patronage were most actively engaging with the translated material to produce original work. Al-Ma'mun himself was intellectually engaged in a way that went beyond mere patronage. He participated in the scholarly debates of his court, held discussions with scholars on questions of theology and philosophy, and supported the Mutazilite theological school, which held that reason and revelation were compatible, and that the use of Greek philosophical tools in Islamic theology was legitimate and even necessary. His investment in scholarship extended to astronomy in a specific and practical form. Al-Ma'mun commissioned the construction of 2 astronomical observatories, one near Baghdad and one in Damascus, equipped with the best instruments available and staffed by the best astronomers his court contained. He commissioned a new measurement of the circumference of the Earth, using the surveying methods developed by the Islamic astronomical tradition, and the measurement his scholars produced was more accurate than any previous attempt. He sent a delegation to Byzantium to collect Greek manuscripts that had not yet been translated, specifically seeking out the texts that his scholars had identified as missing from the corpus. The effort was systematic, deliberate, and guided by a genuine understanding of what was known and what remained to be found. The specific scholars who worked in this environment produced results that changed the history of mathematics and science. Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, whose name gives us the word algorithm, Latinized from al-Khwarizmi to algorithmi, worked at the House of Wisdom in the reign of Al-Ma'mun and produced 2 works that were foundational for the subsequent history of mathematics. The first was a treatise on algebra. The word itself comes from the Arabic al-jab, from the title of the work, Al-Kitab al-Mukhtasar fi Hisab al-Jab wal-Mukbala, the compendious book on calculation by completion and balancing. The second was a treatise on Hindu numerals, the decimal system with the place value notation that we now call Arabic numerals but that originated in India, that introduced these numerals to the Islamic world and, through subsequent Latin translations, to medieval Europe, algebra. The word is so familiar that it has lost its strangeness, but algebra is genuinely one of the most extraordinary intellectual inventions in human history. The specific insight of algebra is that you can treat unknown quantities as if they were known, as if the x and the y were numbers with specific values, and by performing valid mathematical operations on them, arrive at conclusions about their relationships and their values that you could not have reached otherwise. This sounds obvious in retrospect, as all deep insights sound obvious once they have been had. But before Al-Khwarizmi wrote his book, the ancient mathematical traditions of Greece and Babylon and India had not articulated this principle as a general method in a way that could be systematically applied to a wide range of problems. Al-Khwarizmi's book did exactly that. It stated the method, demonstrated it with examples, and explained the valid operations that could be performed on unknowns. It was, in the most precise sense, the invention of algebra. The numerals, the decimal place value system with a symbol for zero, is so deeply embedded in modern mathematical practice that it is genuinely difficult to imagine doing mathematics without it. The Roman numeral system, which was the European standard before the decimal system was adopted, was adequate for accounting and for recording known quantities, but was cumbersome for calculation. Try multiplying MCCCXL7 by DCCCXAC frutai in Roman numerals, and you will quickly understand why. The decimal system, with its place value notation and its zero, makes arithmetic vastly more efficient, and that efficiency translates directly into the speed and scale at which mathematical work can be done. The introduction of the decimal system to Europe via the Arabic transmission of the Indian system through works like Al-Khwarizmi's was one of the most practically significant intellectual transfers in history. Al-Battani, born around 858 CE in the city of Harran in what is now southeastern Turkey, Al-Battani, Albatenius to the medieval Latin scholars who read him, was one of the greatest astronomers of the Islamic world and one of the most accurate observers of the sky in the pre-telescopic era. His measurement of the solar year, the time from one spring equinox to the next, was accurate to within a few seconds of the modern value. His measurements of the inclination of the Earth's axis were more accurate than Ptolemy's. He determined that the direction of the Sun's apparent orbit around the Earth was slowly changing, a phenomenon we now understand as the precession of Earth's axis, and he measured the rate of this change with considerable accuracy. He introduced the use of trigonometric functions, the sine, the cosine, the tangent, into astronomy in a form that directly influenced both the Islamic astronomical tradition and the European astronomy that learnt from it. Al-Razi, Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi, Rhizes to the medieval Europeans, was born in the Iranian city of Ray around 854 CE and became the greatest physician of the medieval Islamic world and, in the judgment of many historians of medicine, one of the greatest physicians in the history of the world. His clinical descriptions of diseases, particularly of smallpox and measles, where his differentiation between the two diseases based on systematic clinical observation was the first accurate distinction in the medical literature, are remarkable for their precision and their honest engagement with the evidence of what actually happened to patients, rather than what the theoretical frameworks of the time predicted should happen. He performed the first known controlled clinical trial in history, using two groups of patients with meningitis to test a specific treatment, and he reported the results honestly when the treatment did not work as expected. His work on chemistry, alchemy, as it was then understood, but in a form that included genuine experimental observation, produced the first systematic classification of chemical substances and the first descriptions of several chemical operations that are still recognizable in modern chemistry. He had a laboratory in the specific modern sense, a space equipped for experimental work, with the equipment to distill and to heat and to combine substances and to observe and record the results. The laboratory tradition of chemistry, the understanding that chemical knowledge is produced by experiment rather than by theoretical speculation, owes something specific to Al-Razi's practice. Ibn Sina, Abu Ali al-Hussein ibn Abdullah ibn Sina, known to the medieval West as Avicenna, was born in 980 CE near the city of Bukhara in what is now Uzbekistan, and died in 1037 CE, 57 years of extraordinary intellectual productivity, much of it in the face of significant political disruption. His most famous work, The Canon of Medicine, is a systematic encyclopedia of medical knowledge that synthesized the Greek tradition of Galen and Hippocrates with the Islamic medical developments of the preceding 2 centuries, and with original clinical observations and theoretical contributions of his own. It was used as a standard medical textbook in both the Islamic world and in European universities until the 17th century, a remarkable longevity that testifies both to the quality of the work and to the specific conservatism of medieval medical education. Ibn Sina is sometimes described as a philosopher who also wrote medicine, sometimes as a physician who also wrote philosophy, and both descriptions are inadequate. He was a person for whom the boundaries between disciplines that we now regard as distinct, medicine and philosophy and theology and mathematics and poetry, were not the primary way of organizing knowledge. He wrote on all of them because he understood them as aspects of a single project, the systematic understanding of reality by human reason, guided by the accumulated knowledge of the tradition, and by personal observation and experience. His philosophical work, particularly his development of Aristotelian metaphysics in an Islamic theological context, was as influential as his medicine, shaping the philosophical debate of medieval Europe through the Latin translations that became available in the 12th century. The translation movement worked in both directions. The Arabic scholarly tradition did not merely receive the Greek intellectual heritage and preserve it passively. It engaged with it, questioned it, extended it, and in many cases surpassed it. When the European scholars of the 12th century began translating Arabic texts into Latin, through the great translation centers at Toledo in Spain and Palermo in Sicily, where Islamic and Christian and Jewish scholars worked together in a cultural complexity that the crusading mentality was busy trying to destroy at the same time. What they received was not the original Greek, or not only the original Greek, but the Greek as processed and extended and improved by the Islamic tradition. The algebra of Al-Khwarizmi, the trigonometry of Al-Battani, the medicine of Ibn Sina, these were not Greek achievements, they were Islamic achievements built on Greek foundations. The specific city. Baghdad in the 9th century was unlike any city that had existed before in that specific form. It was the capital of an empire that stretched from Central Asia to North Africa, from the borders of Byzantium to the Indian subcontinent, and the wealth that flowed through it from the trade networks that connected all these regions produced a concentration of resources that was available for the specific project of intellectual patronage in a way that had not been possible since the Ptolemaic period in Alexandria. The Silk Road trade, the Indian Ocean trade, the overland routes from Persia and Central Asia, all of these passed through or connected to the Baghdad commercial network, and the goods and the ideas they carried contributed to the specific cosmopolitan character of the city. The population of Baghdad in its 9th century peak is estimated at around 500,000 people, perhaps somewhat more, perhaps somewhat less, the sources not being reliably precise on such matters, which made it by far the largest city in the world at that time. Constantinople, its nearest rival, had perhaps 300,000 or 400,000 people. The major cities of Europe at this time, Paris, London, Rome, had populations that could be counted in the tens of thousands. The scale differential between Baghdad and the rest of the world was enormous, and it shaped the specific quality of the intellectual life the city could support, because intellectual life at the highest level requires not just individual genius, but the density of scholars and the institutional support and the critical mass of interested patrons and readers that only a very large and very wealthy city can provide. The specific geography of the House of Wisdom. It was located, in its early form, adjacent to the Caliphal Palace in the Round City. The proximity to power was both institutional and intentional, the Caliph having direct access to the scholars and the scholars having direct access to the Caliph's resources and to the diplomatic connections that allowed books and scholars to be obtained from the far reaches of the empire and beyond. The manuscripts that arrived from Byzantium, from India, from Persia, from the libraries of the cities the Islamic Empire had absorbed, were housed in the library section of the institution, available to the scholars for study and translation. The scholars worked in the institution, but they also worked in their own homes and in the homes of patrons throughout the city. The specific decentralized character of Islamic scholarship not requiring the single institutional location that the European university would later impose, the paper. One of the material preconditions for the specific intellectual achievement of the Abbasid period was the availability of paper, which reached the Islamic world from China via the Central Asian trade routes in the 8th century. Before paper, the primary writing materials in the Islamic world were parchment and papyrus, both of which were expensive and limited in supply. Paper was cheaper, more plentiful, and easier to produce in the specific quantities that a large-scale translation and scholarly publication project required. The specific acceleration of the translation movement in the 8th and 9th centuries was partly enabled by the availability of paper, which made it economically possible to produce the large numbers of manuscript copies that a wide scholarly circulation required. Baghdad had paper mills operating by the late 8th century. The mills were located by the rivers that could power the machinery and provide the water for the pulping process, the specific industrial infrastructure of paper production becoming part of the urban landscape of the Abbasid capital. The paper that the mills produced flowed into the market, was purchased by the scholars and the scribes and the translation bureaus, and was covered with the Arabic script that was filling the intellectual archive of the Islamic world with unprecedented speed. The libraries. The Islamic world of the Abbasid period developed a library culture that was remarkable in its depth and breadth. The House of Wisdom was the most famous, but it was not the only great library. The private libraries of wealthy patrons and scholars were often substantial. Ibn Sina mentions that he read extensively in the library of the Samanid ruler of Bukhara when he was a young scholar, and he describes the library as containing works in many fields, across many rooms. The public libraries that some rulers established in the major cities were sometimes open to scholars from the general public. The mosques maintained collections of books relevant to Islamic learning. The specific density of books in the Islamic intellectual world of the 9th and 10th centuries was extraordinary by any pre-modern standard. The polymath tradition, the specific culture of the Abbasid intellectual world, produced a type of scholar that the more specialized modern world finds remarkable. The polymath, the scholar who worked seriously across multiple disciplines that we now regard as separate fields. Al-Kindi, the first systematic Arab philosopher, working in the 9th century, wrote on philosophy, mathematics, optics, music, medicine, pharmacology, and cosmology. Ibn al-Haytham, working in the early 11th century, produced foundational work on optics and the theory of vision that directly influenced Roger Bacon and ultimately Kepler and Descartes. Al-Biruni, his contemporary, wrote on mathematics, astronomy, geography, anthropology, history, pharmacology, and the specific culture and religion of India, producing in the process the first serious comparative study of a non-Islamic civilization by a Muslim scholar. These were not dilettantes touching many subjects without depth. They were people who worked seriously and originally in each of the fields they engaged with, because the specific intellectual culture they inhabited understood all these fields as aspects of a single project, the rational understanding of God's creation, and therefore as naturally connected rather than artificially separated. The division of knowledge into distinct disciplines, with their own institutional homes and their own professional identities, is a relatively modern development. In the House of Wisdom, a man could move between the Aristotelian philosophy he was editing and the astronomical observations he was making and the clinical records he was keeping, without experiencing these as movements between different worlds. The music. I want to pause on music because the Islamic Golden Age's contribution to music theory is often overlooked in accounts that focus on mathematics and astronomy and medicine. Al-Kindi wrote a treatise on music that was one of the first systematic treatments of music theory in Arabic, drawing on the Greek tradition of Pythagoras and Aristoxenus, but extending it with original observations and Arabic musical categories. Al-Farabi, working in the 10th century, wrote the Great Book of Music, a comprehensive treatment of music theory and practice that was the most systematic medieval treatment of music in any language, considering the physics of sound, the aesthetics of music, the emotional effects of different modes, and the specific instruments and performance practices of the Islamic musical world. The oud, The Arabic lute that is the ancestor of the European lute and through the lute of the guitar was at the center of this musical world. The specific way the oud was constructed and tuned and played was theorized and analyzed by the scholars of the House of Wisdom alongside their work on algebra and astronomy, because in the Islamic intellectual tradition, the harmony of musical intervals and the harmony of celestial motions were aspects of the same underlying mathematical order, the specific order that the Creator had embedded in all things. The 1258 catastrophe. I have been building toward this, and now I have to give it the space it deserves, because the Mongol sack of Baghdad in 1258 CE was not merely a political and military event, it was an intellectual catastrophe of the first order, one of the most significant losses of accumulated knowledge in human history. Hulag Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, arrived at Baghdad in January of 1258 with an army of perhaps 150,000 men. The numbers are disputed and probably somewhat inflated by the sources, but the army was certainly enormous. The Abbasid Caliph al-Mustasim, who was by contemporary account a mediocre ruler who had failed to prepare adequate defences or to form the alliances that might have deterred the Mongol attack, found himself unable to resist. After a siege of about 2 weeks, Baghdad fell in February of 1258. What followed was one of the most complete destructions of a city in the medieval period. The Mongols killed the population of Baghdad. The sources give varying and probably unreliable figures, but the death toll was certainly in the hundreds of thousands. The Caliph was executed. The Caliphate of Baghdad, the institution that had been the political and spiritual center of Sunni Islam for 5 centuries, was extinguished. The physical city was systematically destroyed, the buildings burned, the irrigation systems that had sustained the agricultural hinterland deliberately broken, the specific urban infrastructure that had made Baghdad what it was dismantled, and the books. The House of Wisdom and the other libraries of Baghdad were destroyed. The specific fate of the manuscripts is described in the sources with a detail that suggests it made a specific impression on contemporaries. Books thrown into the Tigris River until the water ran black with ink and red with blood. Books burned, books lost in the chaos of the sack. The river description has the quality of legend. The contrast between the ink-black water and the bloodied city is too neat to be literal. But the underlying reality it encodes is real. The accumulated manuscript holdings of one of the world's great centers of learning were destroyed in a matter of days. Not everything was lost. The Islamic scholarly world was never confined to Baghdad alone, and the scholars who had worked in the House of Wisdom tradition were distributed across the empire, maintaining their own libraries in their own cities. The translation of Arabic texts into Latin had been underway for over a century by 1258, and much of what the Islamic world had produced was already available in European libraries in Latin translation. The Ottoman Empire, which eventually absorbed much of the Abbasid world, maintained its own scholarly tradition. Persian literature and scholarship continued in Iran. The specific intellectual life of the Islamic world was disrupted but not extinguished by the Mongol destruction, but the specific concentration of knowledge in Baghdad, the specific institutional form of the House of Wisdom, the specific urban culture that had supported it, the specific proximity to caliphal patronage that had enabled the extraordinary flourishing of the 9th and 10th centuries, that was gone. The center of the Islamic intellectual world shifted, fragmented, reconstituted in different forms in different places, but never quite recovered the specific density and the specific energy that the House of Wisdom at its peak had embodied. The legacy. What the Islamic Golden Age gave to the subsequent history of human knowledge is so extensive that it is difficult to summarize without making it sound like a list of names. Algebra and the algorithm, the decimal numerals and zero, the clinical method in medicine, the controlled experiment, the trigonometric functions, the astrolabe in its developed form, the concept of the infinitesimal and the beginning of what would eventually become calculus, the astronomical tables that allowed navigation and calendar making, the optical theory that correctly understood light and vision in ways that the Greek tradition had gotten wrong, the philosophy that argued for the rational investigation of nature as a religious duty, not a secular intrusion. But the legacy is not only the list of specific discoveries, it is also the specific form of intellectual culture that the House of Wisdom embodied, the culture that valued translation, that understood the knowledge of other civilizations as worth knowing, that was not threatened by the Greek philosophical tradition or the Indian mathematical tradition, or the Persian literary tradition, but saw in all of them materials for an ambitious synthesis. This is the intellectual culture at its most admirable, curious about everything, willing to be corrected, capable of acknowledging that others have known things worth knowing, committed to the building of knowledge as a collective project across cultures and centuries. There is a scholar in the House of Wisdom in the early 9th century, working by lamplight. He is an Nestorian Christian from Iraq translating a Greek medical text into Arabic for a Muslim caliph who needs this knowledge for the empire he is building. He does not see a contradiction in this. He sees a task. The text exists. The text contains knowledge. The knowledge needs to be available in a language that can carry it forward. He does his work carefully, collating his manuscripts, testing his translations, writing the annotations that will help the next generation of readers understand what the text contains and where it is uncertain. He works slowly because the work is difficult, and he works thoroughly because the knowledge is worth having done right. This is Huneyn ibn Ishaq. This is the House of Wisdom at its most essential. A person doing the patient and unglamorous and essential work of making knowledge available, building the bridge between what was known and what will be known, brick by careful brick. The Tigris ran black with ink when the Mongols came. The books sank or burned, the library fell, but the translations had already travelled, the work had already been done. The algebra was already in Europe, learning to become the mathematics that would eventually produce the physics, that would produce the technology, that would produce the world we live in. The medicine was in the schools. The astronomy was in the observatories. The numbers, the patient revolutionary decimal numbers, with their small circle for zero and their enormous capacity for representing the world, were already in the hands of every person who needed to count. The lamp is out. The books are ash and sediment. The knowledge is everywhere. I wish you a calm and peaceful night. Let me slow down and give the daily life of the House of Wisdom its proper texture, because I have given you the great names and the great discoveries, but the daily reality of the institution was made not only of genius, but of the specific, patient, often unglamorous work that genius requires, the copying and the collating and the annotating, the argument about the meaning of a passage, the search for a manuscript that someone has reported exists somewhere in the empire, the specific debate about whether Aristotle's claim on this point is reconcilable with the teachings of the prophet. The working day of a scholar in the House of Wisdom. He arrived in the morning. Because the scholars were almost all men, in a tradition of scholarship that was, like most pre-modern scholarly traditions, predominantly male, though not entirely so, and I will return to the exceptions. He had probably performed the dawn prayer before coming, and he would perform 4 more prayers at their appointed times through the day, because the schedule of prayer structured the Islamic scholar's day in the same way that the monastic hours structured the European monk's day, as a rhythm of interruption and return that prevented the absorption in work from becoming total, and reminded the scholar of his place in a larger order. The scholar's first task, perhaps, was to examine the manuscripts that had arrived since the previous day. The House of Wisdom was a node in a network, and manuscripts were constantly arriving from the far reaches of the empire and from beyond it, from Byzantine Constantinople, where the Islamic diplomatic missions were instructed to seek out texts that had not yet been translated, from the Persian heartland, where the administrative and literary traditions of the Sassanid Empire were being absorbed into the Islamic scholarly tradition, from the cities of the Levant, where the older Greek traditions had been maintained by the Christian scholarly communities that the Islamic conquest had displaced but not destroyed. The manuscript that arrived from Byzantium was in Greek, possibly a text of Aristotle that was already partly known in Arabic translation, but whose specific Greek text had not been available for comparison. The scholar would begin the work of collation, comparing what was already known in translation with what the new manuscript said, identifying discrepancies and determining which reading was more likely to be authentic, building up by this patient comparative process the most reliable possible text before the work of translation began. This is the scholarly labour that Huneyn ibn Ishaq had elevated into a method, and it was practiced throughout the House of Wisdom by scholars who understood that getting the text right was a precondition for getting the translation right. The debate. The House of Wisdom was not a place of quiet, solitary study. It was a place of argument. The Islamic scholarly tradition of the Abbasid period had inherited from the Greek philosophical tradition through translation, the specific practice of the dialectic, the argument by which competing positions were tested against each other, with each side providing the best possible case for its view, and the better case winning. This was the method of the philosophical schools of late antiquity, and it was taken up with genuine enthusiasm by the Islamic scholars who encountered it, because it was compatible with the specific Islamic intellectual tradition of jurisprudential debate, where competing legal interpretations of the same text were tested against each other in precisely this dialectical form. The arguments in the House of Wisdom could be about anything that the scholars were working on, about the correct translation of a difficult Greek term, about the interpretation of a passage in Aristotle that seemed to conflict with Islamic theological teaching, about the relative merits of two different methods for calculating the position of a planet, about whether al-Razi's new clinical description of a disease was compatible with or superseded what Galen had written on the same subject 3 centuries earlier. These were not merely academic disputes, they were the specific mechanism by which knowledge advanced, by which the simple acceptance of what the translated texts said gave way to the critical engagement with what they said, and the critical engagement gave way to the extension and the improvement that constituted original scholarship, the Translation Bureau. Within the House of Wisdom, there was a specific division devoted to the active work of translation. The translators worked in teams, a scholar who knew both the source language and the target language, doing the initial rendering, an assistant copyist writing out the translation as it was dictated or transcribed, a second scholar with expertise in the specific subject matter reviewing the translation for accuracy, a calligrapher producing the final clean copy. This was not an assembly line in the modern sense, but it was organized, and the organization allowed a pace of output that no single translator working alone could have matched. The specific translation decisions were often genuinely difficult. Greek philosophical terminology, the specific vocabulary of Aristotelian logic and metaphysics, had been developed over centuries in the Greek intellectual tradition and carried with it associations and implications that did not directly map onto Arabic vocabulary. The translators had to decide whether to transliterate, to produce an Arabic spelling of the Greek term, or to find or create an Arabic equivalent. Both strategies had advantages and disadvantages, and the debates about which strategy to use for specific terms were not merely terminological, but genuinely philosophical, because the choice of translation affected the way that subsequent Arabic readers would understand the concept. The creation of Arabic philosophical vocabulary. This is one of the most underappreciated contributions of the translation movement, the systematic creation of a technical vocabulary in Arabic for philosophy, mathematics, medicine, and science. Before the translation movement, Arabic had the vocabulary of the Quran and of Islamic law and of poetry, an extraordinarily rich vocabulary in its own domains, but not a vocabulary that had the specific technical terms that philosophy and science required. The translators created this vocabulary, sometimes by borrowing Greek terms and adapting them, sometimes by finding Arabic roots that could carry the required meaning, sometimes by coining entirely new terms. The vocabulary they created was adopted by subsequent Islamic scholars as the standard terminology of their fields, and many of these terms passed into Latin through the 12th century translations, and from Latin into the European scholarly languages, where they survive in modified form today. The word algebra is the most famous, but there are many others. The word alcohol comes from the Arabic al-Kul, the fine powder that the Islamic alchemists used in their experiments. The word calchemy comes from the Arabic al-Kimiyya, which itself comes from the Greek. The word cipher comes from the Arabic sif, which means 0. The word zenith comes from Arabic, so does nadir, and azimuth, and almanac, and assassin, and dozens of others. These words are linguistic fossils of the specific encounter between the Islamic intellectual tradition and the scientific and philosophical project that the House of Wisdom embodied, the trace of the Arabic in the European vocabulary of knowledge, the Book of 1001 Nights. I want to make a brief excursion to the literary world, because the House of Wisdom operated in a city that was simultaneously producing one of the great literary collections of the medieval world. The stories that eventually crystallized as Alf Layla wa Layla, 1001 Nights, were being collected and expanded in the Baghdad of the Abbasid period, drawing on a mixture of Persian and Indian and Arabic narrative traditions to produce the collection that Scheherazade tells to the Sultan across the 1001 Nights of the frame narrative. These stories were not produced by the scholars of the House of Wisdom, they were the product of a different tradition, the popular narrative tradition of the oral storyteller and the commercial literary culture of the Baghdad Bazaar. But they were produced in the same city, in the same historical moment, and the city that appears in the stories, the Baghdad of Harun al-Rashid, the city of wealth and intrigue and magical transformation, is a version of the same city that housed the translators and the astronomers and the mathematicians. The Harun al-Rashid of the Nights is a legendary figure, walking in disguise through the streets of his capital to hear what his subjects are saying and experiencing the adventures that a caliph's power cannot protect him from. The historical Harun al-Rashid was a complex ruler, brilliant in some ways, cruel in others, a patron of the arts and of scholarship, and also the man who ordered the execution of the Barmakid family, the great Persian administrative dynasty that had served the Abbasids for decades, in a moment of political violence that remains difficult to explain. But the legendary Harun of the Nights and the historical patron of the translation movement are both aspects of the same cultural moment, a city at its peak, confident in its power, curious about its world, generating both the systematic knowledge of the House of Wisdom and the narrative pleasure of the stories that surrounded it. Ibn Fadlan and the world. In 921 CE, the Abbasid Caliph al-Muqtadir sent a diplomatic mission to the king of the Volga Bulgars, a people who had recently converted to Islam and who were seeking formal recognition and assistance from the caliphate. The secretary of the mission was a man named Ahmad ibn Fadlan, and he kept a detailed account of the journey, from Baghdad northward through Persia and Central Asia, across the Volga River into the territory of the Bulgars, and through the lands of the Oghuz Turks and the Pechenegs and other peoples of the steppe. That is one of the most vivid travel accounts of the medieval world. Ibn Fadlan's account is famous for its description of the Rus, the Viking traders and raiders who were operating in the Volga River basin in the early 10th century, trading furs and slaves and amber for the silver dirhams of the Islamic world. His description of a Rus ship burial, the cremation of a chieftain on his ship with a slave woman sacrificed to accompany him, is the most detailed surviving account of this practice, and it is all the more valuable for being the account of an outsider, a Muslim official from Baghdad who was genuinely fascinated by what he was seeing, but who was also genuinely horrified by specific aspects of it, and did not hide his reactions. Ibn Fadlan's engagement with the peoples he encountered is not that of a tourist or a propagandist. It is that of a curious and honest observer, applying the specific intellectual tools of the Islamic scholarly tradition, observation, description, comparison, to the specific human diversity he encountered on the road. This is another dimension of the Islamic Golden Age's contribution, the expansion of the world that was considered worth knowing about. The geographic tradition of the Islamic world in the 9th and 10th centuries, the works of al-Yaqubi and al-Masudi and al-Biruni and al-Idrisi, constituted the most comprehensive body of geographical knowledge of the medieval world, drawing on the reports of merchants and travellers and diplomats and missionaries who moved through the enormous Islamic commercial network from Spain to Indonesia, from sub-Saharan Africa to Central Asia. The Islamic world knew the world in the 9th and 10th centuries more completely than any previous civilization had known it. Al-Biruni's India. The scholar al-Biruni, Abu Rayhan Muhammad ibn Ahmad al-Biruni, born 973 CE in Khwarizm, in what is now Uzbekistan, spent 17 years in India as part of the retinue of the Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni, who had conquered parts of northwestern India. He used those 17 years to learn Sanskrit and to conduct what amounts to a systematic anthropological and scientific study of Indian civilization, its mathematics, its astronomy, its religion, its philosophy, its social organization, its literature. His book on India, the Kitab al-Hind, is one of the most remarkable works of medieval scholarship, a genuinely sympathetic and analytically rigorous engagement with a civilization very different from his own, conducted by a man who understood that understanding required effort and humility, and the willingness to learn the other civilization's language rather than merely describing it from the outside. Al-Biruni's engagement with Indian mathematics was particularly important. He recognized the significance of Indian mathematical achievements, particularly the decimal system and the concept of zero, and was instrumental in transmitting knowledge of these achievements to the Islamic scholarly tradition. The path from the Indian invention of zero to the European adoption of the decimal system runs through Baghdad and through scholars like al-Biruni and al-Khwarizmi, who understood what India had discovered and made it available to the Islamic world, from which it eventually reached Europe. The women scholars. I promised to return to the women, and the picture here is complicated. The Islamic scholarly tradition of the Abbasid period was predominantly but not exclusively male. Women scholars existed. There are records of women who had studied the Hadith, the traditions of the Prophet, and who taught these traditions to male students, which gave them a specific and recognized authority within the Islamic scholarly system. There are records of women physicians and women poets, but the specific institutional context of the House of Wisdom, with its close connection to the caliphal court and its emphasis on the translation and development of the Greek scientific and philosophical tradition, was a predominantly male environment, and the social conditions that would have allowed women to participate fully in that environment did not exist in the Abbasid period. The women who were most visible in the intellectual life of the Abbasid period were the wives and daughters of caliphs and scholars who had access to education through their family connections, and who sometimes exercised real intellectual influence within the specific private space of the household that the gender conventions of the period assigned to them. Zubaydah, the wife of Harun al-Rashid, is known not for scholarship but for the engineering project she commissioned, the construction of a water supply system along the pilgrimage route from Baghdad to Mecca, including wells and cisterns at regular intervals, one of the most significant infrastructure projects of the Abbasid period. She appears in the tradition as a powerful and capable woman operating in the specific domain that her position allowed her, public works, charitable endowment, rather than in the scholarly domain that her husband's patronage enabled for men. The Mongol destruction and the slow recovery. After 1258, the Islamic world's intellectual life continued, but it was different. The center of gravity shifted. Cairo under the Mamluk sultans became an important center of Islamic scholarship, and the Mamluks explicitly positioned themselves as the defenders of the Islamic intellectual tradition that the Mongols had destroyed. Scholars who had fled the Mongol advance found refuge in Mamluk Egypt and in the Ottoman territories and in the Timurid courts of Central Asia. The specific works of the House of Wisdom tradition survived, copied, transmitted, studied in these new locations. But the specific culture of the House of Wisdom, the specific combination of caliphal patronage and cosmopolitan translation and original research and philosophical debate that had produced the Golden Age, did not reconstitute itself. The Ottoman Empire that eventually became the dominant power of the Islamic world was in many ways a great civilization, but it was a different kind of civilization, with different intellectual priorities and different relationships to the classical Greek tradition. The translation movement was not renewed on the same scale. The specific argument about the relationship between reason and revelation that had animated the Mutazilite theology and the philosophical tradition of the 9th and 10th centuries was largely settled in a conservative direction by the 13th century. The intellectual world of the later Islamic tradition was not impoverished, but it was narrower than it had been. The Tigris still runs through what was Baghdad. The city is still there, rebuilt many times after many destructions, the most recent serious one in 2003 and the subsequent years of the Iraq War. The archaeological layers beneath the modern city contain the remains of the round city that al-Mansur built, though they are not accessible for systematic excavation in the current conditions. The river that the Mongol army used to dispose of the books of the House of Wisdom still runs, clearer now than it was in the medieval period, through the city that grew from al-Mansur's circular foundation. The books are gone. Most of them, most of what the House of Wisdom held at its peak, is gone. What survived is what had already been copied and distributed and translated before 1258, and what was not in Baghdad when the Mongols came. The Arabic manuscripts that survived the Mongol period are distributed across libraries in Istanbul and Cairo and Tehran and London and Paris and New York, and dozens of other repositories where scholars are still working to catalogue and analyse and understand them. The Arabic scientific and philosophical tradition was vast, and not all of it has been studied. New manuscripts surface, new texts are identified, new translations are made. The process of recovering what the House of Wisdom produced is not finished. The lamp is out. The books are ash and sediment in the Tigris, but Huneyn's translations are in the libraries. Al-Khwarizmi's algebra is in every calculator and every computer. Al-Battani's star tables are in the history of astronomy. Ibn Sina's medicine shaped what medicine knew for 6 centuries. The decimal numbers, patient, revolutionary, capable of representing the entire cosmos in a system of 10 symbols, are in the hands of every child who learns to count. The Mongols destroyed Baghdad. They did not destroy what Baghdad had made. What Baghdad had made had already travelled in the ships of Venetian and Genoese merchants who traded through Islamic ports and brought home more than goods, in the translations of Toledo and Palermo and Sicily, in the notebooks of European students who studied Arabic astronomy and mathematics before those subjects existed in European languages, in the specific path from the House of Wisdom through the Arabic mathematical tradition to the European algebraic tradition, to the calculus of Newton and Leibniz, to the physics of Einstein. The knowledge is everywhere. It is in the algebra in your child's textbook. It is in the way you write the numbers. It is in the surgical techniques that descended from Al-Razi's experimental medicine. It is in the optical theory that traces back through European optics to Ibn al-Haytham. It is in the word zero, from the Arabic cipher, the nothing that makes all the numbers possible. The House of Wisdom was destroyed. What it built was not. I wish you a calm and peaceful night. Let me take you deeper into the specific intellectual world of the House of Wisdom, because I have given you the great names and the institutional framework, but the daily texture of what it was like to work in that world, to be a scholar in the House of Wisdom in the 9th century, is something I have not yet fully given you. The specific problem of translating Aristotle. The Greek philosopher Aristotle wrote on almost every subject that the ancient world regarded as worth thinking about: logic, metaphysics, physics, biology, psychology, ethics, politics, rhetoric, poetry. His works had been collected and organized by the scholars of the late antique period, and it was in this organized form that they reached the Islamic translators. Translating Aristotle was the central intellectual project of the House of Wisdom's first 2 centuries, and it was a project that went far beyond linguistic transfer. Aristotle's philosophy was a systematic attempt to understand everything, to provide a unified account of reality, of knowledge, of the good life, of the right organization of society, and engaging seriously with that attempt required not just linguistic competence, but philosophical engagement at the deepest level. The specific problems that Aristotle's philosophy posed for Islamic scholars were real and serious. Aristotle's metaphysics implied an eternal universe, which conflicted with the Islamic theological position that God created the universe in time from nothing. Aristotle's account of the active intellect, the source of human rational knowledge, was interpreted by the Islamic philosophers as a form of universal rationality that all human minds participated in, which sat uneasily with the personal relationship between God and the individual believer that Islamic theology emphasized. Aristotle's political philosophy assumed the Greek city-state as the natural political unit, which was not obviously applicable to the universal Islamic community, the Ummah. These were not merely abstract problems. They generated real controversies in the House of Wisdom and in the broader Islamic intellectual world. The Mu'tazilite theological school, which al-Ma'mun supported, took the position that reason and revelation were compatible, that the truths of philosophy could be reconciled with the truths of Islam, that there was ultimately only one truth, and it was knowable by both methods. The Asherite theological school, which eventually became dominant, took a more conservative position. Revelation was primary, and reason was legitimate only within the limits that revelation defined. This debate, essentially the medieval Islamic version of the debate between reason and faith that has been central to theological thinking in multiple traditions, was one of the defining intellectual conflicts of the period, and the House of Wisdom was where much of it was conducted. Al-Farabi, the philosopher known to the medieval West as Al-Farabius, was born around 870 CE, probably in the region of what is now Kazakhstan, and died in 950 CE in Damascus. He is sometimes called the second teacher, the first being Aristotle, an honorific that tells us how the Islamic philosophical tradition understood his place. Al-Farabi worked at the intersection of Greek philosophy and Islamic theology more systematically than any of his predecessors, developing a philosophical account of prophecy and of the relationship between philosophy and religion that allowed him to argue that the philosopher and the prophet were both engaged in the same fundamental cognitive activity, the apprehension of truth, but that the Prophet communicated this truth to the general population through the specific medium of images and narrative that the general population could understand, while the philosopher communicated it through the specific medium of demonstration that the trained intellect required. This is a sophisticated position, and it is also a politically significant one. It preserves the authority of the philosopher in the Islamic world by placing philosophical and prophetic knowledge in a hierarchical relationship in which the philosopher's understanding is at one level deeper and more precise than the prophet's, because it is unmediated by the images and narratives that the general population requires. It was not a position that later Islamic theology found acceptable, and al-Farabi's influence was contested and limited within the Islamic world in ways that his influence on the medieval European philosophical tradition was not. Aquinas read him, or knew his thought, through the Latin translations, and the specific solution al-Farabi proposed to the problem of reason and revelation was one of the options available to the medieval Christian tradition as it worked through the same problem. The observatories. I mentioned that Al-Ma'mun commissioned astronomical observatories, and I want to give this development its proper weight because it represents something specific about the relationship between theory and observation in the Islamic scientific tradition. The Greek astronomical tradition, in its Ptolemaic form, was primarily theoretical. It provided mathematical models for predicting the positions of the celestial bodies, models that were tested against observation, but that were not continuously revised in the light of ongoing systematic observation. The Islamic astronomical tradition, beginning with the translators who worked through Ptolemy and identified his errors, developed a more actively empirical approach, ongoing systematic observation at observatories, continuous revision of the tables and models in the light of the observations, genuine engagement with the possibility that Ptolemy was wrong. The systematic observation program at Al-Ma'mun's observatories produced revisions of Ptolemy's planetary tables that were more accurate than Ptolemy's originals. It produced more accurate measurements of the precession of the equinoxes, of the obliquity of the ecliptic, of the lengths of the seasons, and it produced in the process a community of observers who were accumulating data about the heavens over decades, building the kind of long-term observational record that is necessary for identifying the slow processes, the precession, the secular changes in orbital parameters that short-term observation cannot detect. The specific practice of astronomical observation in the Islamic world, the instrument design, the record-keeping, the mathematical processing of observational data, became one of the most important streams of influence on the European astronomical revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries. Copernicus acknowledged using Islamic astronomical tables. Tycho Brahe's observational program was shaped by the instruments and the methods of the Islamic astronomical tradition. The specific chain from the House of Wisdom's observatories to the Copernican revolution is not simple or direct, but it is real. The Islamic philosophers on vision. The question of how vision works, how we see the world, was one of the most contested questions in the ancient scientific tradition, and the Islamic scholars of the Golden Age made crucial progress on it. The Greek tradition had divided on the question. The Platonic tradition held that vision was due to rays proceeding from the eye, which encountered the objects and returned to the eye with information about them. The Aristotelian tradition held that the eye was passive, receiving forms from the objects through the medium of air. Both were wrong, but in different ways and to different degrees. Ibn al-Haytham, al-Hazen to the medieval Europeans, who worked in Cairo in the early 11th century, was the scholar who got vision right. In his Book of Optics, he demonstrated through a combination of careful argument and experimental observation that vision was due to rays of light proceeding from objects to the eye, that the eye was passive and the light was active, and that the specific structure of the eye, which he described with considerable anatomical accuracy, processed the incoming light to produce the image of the world that we perceive. His account of the camera obscura, the dark room with a small hole through which an inverted image of the outside world can be projected onto the opposite wall, was the decisive experimental demonstration of his theory of vision, and it remained the primary tool for understanding and demonstrating the physics of vision for centuries. Ibn al-Haytham's account of scientific method is as significant as his specific results in optics. He argued explicitly that the investigation of nature must be based on observation and experiment, that the authority of previous scholars, even Ptolemy, even Aristotle, must be submitted to the test of evidence, and that the job of the natural philosopher was to let the evidence speak rather than to defend what the tradition had said. This is, in its essential structure, the scientific method, and while the history of science is too complicated for any single person or tradition to be credited with inventing the scientific method, Ibn al-Haytham's articulation of it in the context of his optical investigations is as clear and as explicit as any articulation in any tradition before the European scientific revolution. Al-Kindi's On First Philosophy. The first systematic philosopher in the Arabic tradition, Al-Kindi, who worked in the House of Wisdom in the reign of Al-Ma'mun and his successors, wrote a text called On First Philosophy that is in some ways the founding document of Islamic philosophical inquiry. It is a defense of the legitimacy of philosophy for Muslim scholars, an argument that the pursuit of truth through reason is not only compatible with Islamic faith, but is actually a religious duty, since the truth that philosophy seeks is the same truth that God created and that revelation communicates. The argument draws on both Islamic theological categories and Greek philosophical concepts, performing in its very structure the synthesis that the House of Wisdom was committed to. Al-Kindi's defense of philosophy was not uncontested. The conservative theological tradition found the importation of Greek categories into Islamic thought problematic, and the debates about the relationship between philosophy and theology that Al-Kindi's work initiated continued for centuries, generating the most important philosophical controversies of the medieval Islamic world, and eventually, through the translations, the most important philosophical controversies of the medieval European world. The specific argument about the eternity of the world, about the nature of the soul, about the relationship between divine providence and human free will. All of these were crystallized by the Islamic philosophical tradition and passed, through the translations, to the European tradition, where they generated the debates that shaped medieval and early modern philosophy. The calligraphers. The House of Wisdom could not have functioned without the calligraphers, the professional copyists who produced the manuscript copies of translated and original works that constituted the publications of the period. In an age before printing, every book was a handmade object, and the quality of the book depended on the quality of the scribe who copied it. The Islamic calligraphic tradition had developed, from the earliest period of the faith, an extraordinarily high standard for the visual presentation of written text, because the Quran was the word of God and the book that contained it deserved to be beautiful. The specific aesthetics of Islamic calligraphy, the way that the Arabic script could be made into a visual composition that was simultaneously readable and decorative, reached its most elaborate expression in the Quran manuscripts, but the same standards applied, with varying degrees of elaboration, to all serious manuscript production. The calligraphers who worked in the House of Wisdom were not artists in the modern sense. They were craftsmen with a specific technical skill, trained in a specific tradition, employed to produce objects that had to be both beautiful and accurate. The beauty and the accuracy were not separate demands. A beautiful manuscript was one whose calligraphy was clear and consistent and free of error, and a manuscript full of errors was not beautiful regardless of its visual appearance. The calligraphers who copied the translations of Huneyn ibn Ishaq were under the same professional obligation as the translators themselves, to do the work right. The paper mills. The specific material infrastructure of the House of Wisdom included the paper mills that produced the paper on which the manuscripts were written. The technology of paper making had arrived in the Islamic world from China via Central Asia, and by the early 9th century Baghdad had its own paper mills, operating on the streams that fed the Tigris. The paper that they produced, made from linen rags and other plant fibers, producing a surface that took ink well and could be folded and stored with relative durability, was significantly cheaper than parchment, and the lower cost of the writing material meant that books could be produced in larger numbers and could circulate more widely. The Islamic world of the 9th and 10th centuries had a book market, a commercial trade in manuscripts that was remarkable by medieval standards. Booksellers in Baghdad and other major cities maintained stocks of manuscripts and sold them to scholars and to the educated reading public. The bookseller Ibn al-Nadim compiled in the late 10th century a catalogue of all the books available in Arabic, a document called the Fihrist, the Index, that listed thousands of titles with their authors and brief descriptions, and that is one of our most important sources for understanding the scope of the Islamic scholarly tradition. The Fihrist is the bibliographic record of a civilization at its intellectual peak, comprehensive, specific, and evidence of a reading public large enough to sustain a commercial book market. The fall of the Round City. Al-Mansur's circular round city, the physical form that had announced Baghdad's cosmological pretensions, was already changing within a generation of its completion. The city expanded rapidly beyond its original walls as the population grew and as the specific urban functions that a capital city generates. The markets, the workshops, the residential neighborhoods for the enormous population of people serving the court and the administration pushed beyond the limits of the original plan. By the 9th century, Baghdad was a sprawling city that covered both banks of the Tigris, with the round city at its historical core, but surrounded by districts that had no relationship to the original circular plan, the floods. The Tigris was as much a threat as a resource. The river that provided Baghdad's water supply and its commercial highway also flooded, repeatedly and sometimes catastrophically. The records of the Abbasid period include accounts of major floods that damaged or destroyed large sections of the city, including sections of the palace complex and the House of Wisdom's facilities. The urban engineering challenges of maintaining a large city on the floodplain of a major river were real and ongoing, and the Abbasid Caliphate invested substantially in the dike and canal systems that managed the Tigris's water. Investments that, when they were maintained, produced the extraordinary agricultural productivity of the Mesopotamian floodplain, and whose failure, when they were not maintained, contributed to the general decline of the civilization. The specific moment before the Mongols. In 1258, the Caliph al-Mustasim was, by the accounts of contemporaries, a ruler who did not understand what was coming. The Mongol threat had been visible for decades. The Mongols had been expanding westward since Genghis Khan's campaigns in the early 13th century, and they had destroyed major Islamic cities including Samarkand and Nishapur before turning toward Baghdad. There were parties within Baghdad's ruling circles who understood that the only viable response was negotiation or submission, and parties who counselled resistance. Al-Mustasim, indecisive and poorly advised, failed to make the decision effectively either way. When Hulagu's forces arrived at the city in January of 1258, the siege lasted about 2 weeks. The defenders were inadequate. The Abbasid army had been reduced by decades of political decline and fiscal crisis, and the Mongol military machine was at this point probably the most effective large-scale military force in the world. The city fell. The destruction that followed was systematic and deliberate, the Mongol policy of example in full application, destroying a major city so thoroughly that its fate would deter resistance elsewhere. The specific act of destroying the books deserves a moment's attention, because it was not, in the Mongol context, an act of cultural barbarism in the sense that we might assume. The Mongols at this stage of their expansion were not particularly anti-intellectual or anti-cultural. They would within a few generations become patrons of art and literature and scholarship in their own right, and Hulagu himself was interested in science and supported scholars at his own court. The destruction of Baghdad's books was not motivated by hostility to knowledge. It was motivated by the specific logic of the destruction of Baghdad as a whole, to eliminate the city as a functioning center of wealth and power and culture, to demonstrate the completeness of the conquest. This makes it no less a catastrophe. The completeness of the Mongol destruction was specifically targeted at the things that made Baghdad what it was, and the books and the libraries were among those things. What survived? The scholars who were not in Baghdad when the Mongols came, the books that had already been distributed to other libraries, the translations that were already in Latin in the European universities, the astronomical tables that had already been copied and were in use at observatories from Spain to Persia, the mathematical treatises that had already generated centuries of further mathematical development, the medical encyclopedias that were already the standard texts of medical education across 3 continents. The House of Wisdom was a building, or a complex of buildings, in a city that was destroyed. But what it had produced had long since escaped the building, travelling in the minds and the manuscripts of the scholars who had worked in it and learnt from it, across the enormous territory of the Islamic world and beyond its borders, into the Latin West and the Byzantine East. The Mongols could burn the building. They could destroy the manuscripts that remained in it. They could kill the scholars who were there, but they could not unlearn algebra or unread Ptolemy's tables in their corrected form, or take back from the European universities the mathematical and philosophical tradition that the translators of the House of Wisdom had given them, the scholar working by lamplight. I want to return to this image because it is the image that the House of Wisdom gives me that I find most essential. Not the great Caliph and his treasuries of knowledge, not the famous names in the history of science, but the specific scholar at work. The scholar who is translating a difficult passage of Galen and is uncertain about a medical term and goes back to the Greek and realizes that the Greek itself is ambiguous and writes a note in the margin explaining the ambiguity so that the next reader will know about it. The scholar who is calculating a planetary position from the tables that Al-Battani produced and realizes that the position doesn't match the observation and writes in his own notebook that the tables need to be revised. The scholar who is teaching a student the fundamentals of algebra and watching the student's face as the concept of the unknown quantity suddenly becomes clear. These are the people of the House of Wisdom, not the institution and not the Caliph's patronage, but the specific human beings doing the specific work of making knowledge available and making it grow. The work was patient and difficult and often unglamorous and conducted by people who did not think of themselves as making history. They thought of themselves as doing what needed to be done, which was to understand as much as possible of the world that God had made and to share that understanding with anyone who would receive it. The Tigris ran black with ink. The city burned. The caliphate ended. The round city dissolved back into the alluvial soil of the Mesopotamian floodplain, and the knowledge travelled on. In the ships and the caravans and the packs of pilgrims and the notebooks of merchants and the memories of students, the knowledge that the House of Wisdom had assembled and extended and generated travelled away from Baghdad in every direction, into every world that would receive it, into the future that it was making possible. The algebra is in your calculator. The zero is in your phone's screen. The clinical method is in the hospital. The decimal numbers are everywhere, representing everything, making possible the mathematics that the ancient world could not do without them. The House of Wisdom is gone. What it built is not. I wish you a calm and peaceful night.